I think we should start. So good afternoon, everybody, and or good morning, depending on where you're logging in from. So welcome to this webinar on access to nutrition. How can we make nutritious food affordable to all? So my name is Nick Chisholm, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Global Development here in University College Cork. And I'm also a senior lecturer in international development, and I'd like to welcome you all to this this webinar. So this is the second of a series of 3 webinars that the Centre for Global Development and the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development are jointly holding on the broad sort of area of food systems and nutrition. The overall aim of the webinar series is to contribute to dialogues amongst Irish development organizations and more widely on some key food system challenges, and particularly in the context of the run-up to the UN Food Systems Summit later this year. So we held the first webinar on the 26th of March, and that looked at the impact of COVID-19 on food systems and how to build back better. This webinar today focuses on the issue of affordability of nutritious diets and the challenge around that. And then there's a third webinar on the 30th of April, which will address women's empowerment in nutrition. We have actually registered these events as independent food systems dialogues as part of the UN Food Systems Summit process. So the issues arising from the webinars will be fed into the broader Food Systems Summit process, and we'll be obviously kind of writing reports on each of the webinars and feeding those in. I'd like to thank in advance the co-conveners of the webinars. That's Patrice Lucid of IFIAD and my colleague Solange Cullen here in UCC for the really fantastic work they're doing in putting these webinars together. It's quite an undertaking, but I really would like to thank them very sincerely, and also like to thank Isabel McLaughlin for the technical support to these events, which is absolutely essential. We are recording the webinars, and also this one is live streamed, so it'll be available on YouTube after possibly after 24 hours, and then we'll be also putting the recordings of the webinars up on our websites, the Centre for Global Development website and the IFIAD website in due course. So in relation to this webinar, it focuses on the problem of widespread lack of access to nutritious foods due to lack of affordability. I'll leave Sophie to introduce the webinar in more detail, the topic of the webinar in more detail. But you're gonna hear some great speakers on this issue, and Sophie will introduce them. Since Sophie is Sophie Healy-Thao is the chair for this webinar. Before introducing Sophie, I just also like to mention that here in UCC we're doing a lot of work on food security and nutrition linkages. You can follow us on Twitter at UCC Food Security. We also have a master's program that addresses these kind of issues, and this is my kind of promo basically for our master's program. I'll put details of that into the chat. So now I have great pleasure in introducing Sophie Healy-Thao, who is going to chair this webinar. Sophie is already an inspiring figure in terms of her work on food systems, bringing a really important youth perspective. Sophie is still, it's hard to believe, but still an undergraduate student here in UCC, but she has a long list of achievements already to her name. Just to mention a couple of them, she and her team from Kinsale Community School won the Global Google Science Prize in 2014 for work on accelerating crop growth. She is currently the only youth member globally in the Scaling Up Nutrition Lead Group. And I know she's kind of leading a range of youth initiatives in the Food Systems Summit process, and I think in the Nutrition for Growth process as well. So Sophie is quite an inspiring person and a very appropriate person to chair this webinar. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Sophie.
Oh, thank you so much, Nick, for that really kind introduction. And thank you for having me, and thank you for involving young people in this process. Happy Friday, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. It's a really, really exciting panel we have today, and we have great room for discussion as well through the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. Please keep all conversation in the chat box. So there's two different structures. So we will have 3 sessions today. In our first session, we will look at the cost and affordability of healthy diets globally with Anna Herforth. Our second session will take a closer look at what Irish and international development partners are doing around cost of diet and access to nutrition. In our third session, we will look at game changers for access to nutrition with Karina Hawkes. Looking forward to the UN Food System Summit. So again, we will have opportunities for question and answers at the end of all the sessions, and I encourage all panelists and all attendees to use the Q&A facility on the bottom of your screen. So we look forward to an interesting and insightful discussion, and I would like to introduce and get straight into the panel, our session 1 on cost and affordability of healthy diets globally. And I'd like to introduce Anna Herforth, who is going to present an overview of COVID-19 impacts on food security and nutrition. Dr. Herforth is a senior fellow of the Food Prices for Nutrition projects at Tufts University. Her current research focuses on measuring diet quality globally, affordability of nutritious diets and food environments, and she co-founded and co-leads the Agriculture Nutrition Community of Practice, also known as Ag to Nut, a professional community of over 7,500 members from over 130 countries. So no better person to talk on this topic. Welcome, Anna. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Sophie. I'm happy to be here talking about the cost and affordability of healthy diets globally. And if my slides could come up, I will start to share with everyone. Thank you. So indeed, I'm going to be sharing with you a study from the Food Prices for Nutrition project with my collaborators who are listed here: Jan Bai, Ash Venkat, Christy Mart, Alyssa Ebel, and Will Masters at Tufts University. And this is the first study that has looked across all countries at what does it actually cost to purchase a healthy diet. And next slide. This comes from the background paper that we wrote for the SOFI 2020, the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World report, which I'm sure many people here have seen. And you can find these reports online. I will put them in the chat box as well. I will just be sharing the main results from the background paper, which it's been wonderful that they have been taken up in the SOFI report, because really what we aimed to do was to present new information on food security in terms of access to adequate food. Next slide. With this work, our vision is that food price measurement should be used to match this aspiration, which I'm sure is very familiar to everyone here. The aspiration is what the global community agreed 25 years ago as what it means to be food secure. That food security is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And we really haven't tracked this. We've tracked aspects of it, different facets of food security, but we really wanted to get to understanding of, do people have access to nutritious food to meet dietary needs, to fulfill what is needed for this active and healthy life. Next slide. So our aim was to determine, if you went to an average market in any country, how much would it cost to obtain a diet that satisfies dietary guidelines, recommendations for having adequate nutrients and adequate foods to protect health and provide a balanced and dignified diet. And how many people could not afford this minimum cost? Next. And to do this, we used a few different benchmarks along the way to a healthy diet. And I'd like to say from the start that, just because one can afford a healthy diet doesn't necessarily mean that it's consumed. Of course, a lot of people, myself and probably everyone here included, doesn't always eat a healthy diet just because it's affordable. When diets are affordable, food prices are one of many influences on food choice, a very important influence, but there are of course many others. But when healthy diets are unaffordable, food prices become an insurmountable barrier to improve diet quality. And we wanted to understand for how many people is that true, where no amount of nutrition education, better food choices is going to solve this problem of unaffordability and lack of access. So first we looked at a benchmark of what does it cost to meet calorie adequacy for short-term subsistence, just to get through the day with enough energy, avoid starvation. And then the next benchmark was nutrient adequacy. What's the theoretical minimum amount that would be required to meet all micronutrient, macronutrient needs, avoid deficiencies, and avoid excesses of essential nutrients? But of course, a healthy diet is more than that. It also meets food group recommendations. A healthy diet is a behaviorally more realistic way to meet nutrient requirements, as food-based dietary guidelines have the purpose of providing information to the public. How can you consume a diet that meets your needs? How can you consume a diet that meets nutrient needs and that also will protect health against non-communicable disease and satisfy cultural norms and palatability and proportionality of healthy, desirable plate of food? So that's what we're really going to focus on, is that healthy diet being the standard that would meet that definition of food security, of access to nutritious food to meet dietary needs. And then beyond that, there are other goals. There are food preferences, convenience, might cost a little bit more. There are lots of ways you could eat healthy diets that are very expensive, but we look at what is the minimum cost that would be required to meet these food group recommendations for a balanced, healthy diet. Next slide. So we look at least cost diets. In each place, this is based on the cheapest combination of foods that would meet the criteria for the diet. And there's no standard set of items in the least cost basket. The items would vary by time and place, drawing on locally available or seasonal items. It depends on, if you have a list of 100 or 200 foods in a given country in a given time, which of those, long list of items are going to be the cheapest ones at that time, which would, provide enough fruits and vegetables, provide enough the starchy staple, etc. So we look for least cost diets where the items would shift over time depending on what's cheapest. And we use this to provide an estimate of the lower bound on the cost per day of meeting each dietary standard. And again, adding food preferences and convenience would raise these estimated costs and raise the number of people who can't afford the diet. Next. To do this, we use a unique data set. The World Bank's International Comparison Program has this agenda to look at cost of living across countries and determine comparability of costs. And within this agenda, they have a lot of data on food prices, because food prices are, of course, a very major component of the cost of living. So we used their latest data set, which was from 2017, and it has global and regional food lists that in total include 680 foods and non-alcoholic beverages across 173 countries. There are not that many foods in each country. That's the total number of foods. But there's quite a diverse list of foods and food prices in every country to enable us to do these analyses. Next. So to the results, right, straight away. The findings are, on average, globally, it costs less than $1, 79 US dollars per day to meet daily energy needs using just the most affordable starchy staple. This is not a recommended diet, of course, but it's unfortunately a diet that sometimes some people in the world need to resort to based on economic situation. And that is the average cost of just meeting energy needs. Then when we look at the very least cost of meeting nutrient requirements, that can't be done less than $2.34 on average across countries. That's the result of linear programming to satisfy, the cheapest combination of foods to meet nutrient requirements. It's not what people would probably be able to achieve at that least cost, because we had to use computers to come up with those precise amounts of foods to get to that lowest cost. But it is a benchmark of the absolute minimum for nutrient needs. Then when you get to kind of a more realistic way that people would obtain those nutrient requirements and other needs to meet dietary recommendations, the cost goes up to an average of $3.68 per day, with a range that you can see there to meet dietary recommendations. And the way that we did this was to use actually 10 different definitions of a healthy diet that have been published by UN member states, because there's no single definition of exactly what a healthy diet is. There are many different kinds of healthy diets that share generally a lot of characteristics. So we calculated the cost of each of 10 different definitions to come up with a point estimate and a range. Next. Here you can see those different definitions that we used. This is a range of countries from different regions, many highly populated countries. And these dietary guidelines, it's important to note, constitute national policy in the countries where they have been formulated. They are recommendations for the general population. They're meant to be applied for everyone. And I think that in many programs that we use in global nutrition, these are often used as a basis for nutrition communication on how people can choose healthy diets. So it's very important to know whether choosing healthy diets according to what is, officially recommended as a way to eat healthfully is feasible for people. Next. This shows the results of all of those different guidelines. Also, we additionally looked at the cost of the Eat Lancet diet, different formulations of it as another reference diet. And what you can see here is that some of the specific country guidelines are a little bit more expensive than others. This is the average cost. So, taking the first case, applying the Argentina guidelines to all countries, applying the Benin guidelines to all countries. On average, this is what the cost of meeting that particular set of guidelines is. And you can see there's a little bit of variation, but they're really quite similar in the range of costs that would be required to meet them. And the bottom line here is that by any definition you use, healthy diets are far more expensive than here shown the entire international poverty line of $1.90, let alone the upper bound of that poverty line that can be credibly reserved for food, which is $1.20, part of income has to be spent on non-food, housing and transportation, other essential expenses of life. So it's showing here that really we don't need to be too concerned of exactly which definition we use. They are all too expensive. Next. So then we further looked at how many people in the world can't afford these costs. And to do this, we just took the fact that in the poorest income quintile in low-income countries spends an average of 63% of expenditures on food. As people become wealthier, that percentage goes down. So we just took that as kind of the maximum amount that could be spent on food. The rest of expenditures has to be reserved for other things. So we compared the cost of each diet to 63% of income using the World Bank estimated 2018 income distributions across 164 countries. Next. And the bottom line finding is that about 3 billion people globally lack sufficient income to purchase the least cost form of healthy diets that are recommended by national governments, fully aligned with international standards of scientific consensus. Calorie affordability is still a problem in some countries, and we don't want to lose sight of that. That is definitely a vital issue for those places where calories even are not accessible. But then when we look to nutrients and healthy diets, most people in sub-Saharan Africa cannot even meet the nutrient adequate baseline benchmark, let alone the healthy diets. Most people throughout South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa would be unable to afford those healthy diets. Next. To show the statistics, it's over 1 billion people in South Asia, also a significant number in Southeast Asia, and 829 million estimated in sub-Saharan Africa. Thanks. And then looking at the cost of the different components of the diet, this is sort of a very boring version of a dietary guide, food-based guide, which are usually very colorful and full of foods, but you can imagine them here. And the fruits and vegetables of this healthy plate would account for about 40% of the cost of the recommended diet. Even fruits and veg alone are above that lower bound of the poverty line that could be reserved for food. Same for the more protein-rich foods, plant and animal source foods, a little bit above 40% of the cost would be for those. Starchy staples and oils account for only 16% of the cost. So those are the cheap foods. Those are clearly where people who are low income are going to go, explaining a lot about why diets are not diverse and why diet quality is poor for a lot of people. Next. So conclusions of this work, really, the cost of nutritious diets in the market is more than many people can afford. This has been further exacerbated by COVID-19. We did an update to this by estimating how incomes and prices have changed, and the number of people who can't afford it has gone up slightly. The depth of unaffordability, so becoming, incomes falling even further from that $3.68 on average amount has that gap has widened due to COVID-19. And therefore, existing food systems and assistance programs are not fulfilling longstanding aspirations for global food security, for access to nutritious diets that meet dietary needs. And this has implications for poverty, social protection, and agriculture. Next slide. Firstly, we need to reconsider poverty lines. If the poverty line is set based on the calorie equivalent of a common diet of the poor, this is showing that that's not enough to satisfy dietary needs. Specifying an inadequate diet within a poverty line probably is not doing us favors in terms of how we understand poverty in the world and lack of access to nutritious recommended food as a basic need. Next. What do we need to do in agriculture? I think the rest of this event, there will be a lot of conversation about that. Here's a few thoughts to get the conversation started. Social protection maybe needs to include assistance for home production of foods where that is viable as an option. This picture shows some healthy gardening kits in Tanzania, where I did some work several years ago. And also another picture from Tanzania showing breeding efforts for underutilized, very nutritious green leafy vegetables. Here is shown amaranth, trials of agricultural testing. And that's probably a priority too, investment in research and development for more diverse foods than the agriculture research and development portfolios have focused on for the last several decades. Next. And just to clarify, we want to reduce the cost of nutritious food, but not at all costs, right? There are ways that we need to reduce the costs and ways that we should not reduce the cost. Do we want to lower agriculture and food worker wages? Do we want more intensive animal production that discounts animal welfare or water quality? Do we want to cut down forests to produce more food and make it cheaper? No, we don't want to do any of those things. We don't want more trade protectionism to reduce the cost of nutritious food in a particular country. What we do need is investing in research and development of more diverse foods, increasing diversity in the food supply, increasing viable opportunities for farmers to diversify, to make that less risky, to invest in environmentally and socially sustainable ways to produce animal source foods, which are targeted to the poor, not only available to the more wealthy, which often happens with animal source foods. We need innovations for cold chains, for foods that have perishability issues, and better market infrastructure to allow movement of products so that in areas where there are diverse foods, that can benefit more than just a local area, can benefit others as well. So bottom line, we need more diversification and connectivity, not externalizing true costs as a way towards reducing costs of healthy diets. Next. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present. I want to thank FAO for supporting this analysis I shared with you today, and also the supporters, the funders of the Food Prices for Nutrition project at Tufts, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and UK Aid. So thanks a lot. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for that really insightful presentation. I think what really struck me was the amount of different dietary guidelines. And I know in my education of food in primary and secondary school, we're only taught about the dietary guidelines that suit our country. And sometimes I think that limits the possibilities for more collaboration and innovation into the future if we're only struck in this tunnel vision in our education system of food. So I found that really, really interesting. And also your point on we want to reduce the cost of nutritious food, but not at all costs, and that need for more innovation and better market systems and logistics to ensure that nutritious food isn't expensive for all people, and also that people aren't fed the narrative that nutritious food is expensive, which I think is really, really important looking into the future. So thank you so much. I've taken a lot of notes. I see that we have a question, two questions in, three, another just came in. So firstly, I'm going to take Sylvia Kaufman's question. So she said, excellent recommendations. Do we have experience in consumer subsidies for diversified diets or producer subsidies for diversifying production?
That's a great question, Sylvia. And I don't have a lot of examples in mind for that. There may be other participants or panelists who maybe have potentially have experience with that or know some evidence themselves. So I'll toss that back to the group for others to comment on. of whether there have been consumer subsidies or producer subsidies for diversification.
I would also like to welcome Nick back to the stage to field these more scientific questions with me. If that's okay, Nick.
Yeah, are you asking me to give an answer to that question, is it?
If you have one, or if you see any more questions that I might not be the best person to field in the Q&A.
Well, I suppose just on that one, I mean, it's not exactly consumer subsidies, but I suppose in the area of social protection, which Anna mentioned briefly, I think one of the recommendations, I guess, from this work is, diversifying social protection in the sense of that social protection transfers could include more nutritious diets rather than simply providing staples, rather than providing sort of just grains and fats and oils, well, oils basically. So I'm in terms of those kind of consumer subsidies as such, I can't think of examples, but in the area of social protection for low-income households, it's a way of ensuring a more diversified diet in that sort of way. I guess that was how I would answer that. There's another question that's come in there. I don't know, can you see that, Sophie? It's quite a long question. Do you want to take that?
Sure. So we have an anonymous question. Given that dairy and protein-rich foods currently account for a large proportion of the cost of the global healthy diet, would it make sense to encourage the true price of such foods to be realized in terms of their resource intensiveness, environmental impact, and high level of farm support, at least in higher income countries? And over to you.
Yeah, that's kind of getting towards that point in my very last slide of not wanting to reduce costs at all costs. We already externalize a lot of costs of animal sourced foods, especially in some countries more than others, where there are even subsidies towards especially meat production, which is ecologically very high on the food chain. I think of it in terms of ecology, where just based on resource use, the organisms that are higher on a food chain take more resources, and therefore they should be more expensive than foods that take fewer resources to produce. So I agree, we have to keep in mind, what is the real cost of producing such foods. To clarify the protein-rich food category in the guidelines, the majority of countries, when they have a category like that, it's both plant and animal source food. So typically in these least cost diets, what's selected is legumes and sometimes nuts and seeds, ground nuts. In every case, I think there's only 2 countries in the world where the cheapest sources of protein-rich foods were not plant source. So when you look at that pie chart, keep in mind that the protein-rich foods is probably legumes and ground nuts more than anything else. And then the dairy, in some cases, we allowed small fish to be in that category as in some countries, dairy from cows is not the main source, is not really culturally consumed. And in some guidelines in Benin, it's even explicitly said that small fish can count in that category. So there's that as well. But I agree with the point of, the cost of foods. We should be thinking about what does it take to actually produce them in terms of lowering those costs sustainably.
Okay, great. Tough questions. There's a lot in the Q&A box as well, so I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but maybe you can type some of them. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions in one here. One from Mesfin. what proportion of the population in the developed world have access to healthy diets? And they later say, I mean, leave alone the lower middle income countries. And another one from Lilia. The slide comparing country prices shows Vietnam median of $3.25 versus USA. I found this somehow difficult to perceive as USA food prices are highest in the world, especially for meat. Can you comment on this one?
Yeah, I think the answer to both of those questions is maybe the same answer. It's so a clarification, the different dietary guidelines in that bar graph were costs of meeting those guidelines across every country. So it was not costs of food in Vietnam versus costs of food in the United States. It was the cost of meeting the Vietnam government dietary guideline as a definition of a healthy diet anywhere, and meeting the US government dietary guideline as another definition of a healthy diet. These definitions are developed for countries, but they're really generalizable because they are what's specific about meeting dietary guidelines is the foods themselves, not the food groups. The food groups are quite consistent for what humans need to support health. So we have different, specifics around the amounts of fruits and vegetables. Maybe it's 350 grams in one country, maybe it's 500 grams in another country, but there's going to be a very similar kind of range of the food groups that are recommended. And then we use prices from each country on items available in that country to calculate the cost. And it actually turns out that there's not a huge difference in the cost of diets across different countries. Prices in the US are not higher. Again, we're talking about least cost diets, not food prices in general, not the price of meat. It barely even shows up in these diets because it's not least cost. So we're looking at least cost foods in every country. They're quite similar. And so that's why we see very many people in sub-Saharan Africa who cannot afford that cost. Many people who have incomes that are lower than $3.68 per day or whatever it is in the country specifically. It may be that's the global average. And in the United States, most people have incomes that are much higher than $3.68 a day. So very few people cannot afford that diet in high income countries. I think I got all the pieces of that question. Let me know if I missed something.
There's so many coming into the chat. I think we only have time for one more, but maybe you can type your answers to others. So we have a question from Catherine. How do we engage especially graduate students from these sub-regions to participate and inform the policymakers of their different countries?
Graduate students, I'm not sure as a specific community. I mean, graduate students have a lot of a particular resource, I guess, that's not available to many others, which is time and space to innovate. So doing research on aspects of maybe interventions that could be done to lower costs or otherwise improve access to nutritious foods. We do have the Ag to Newt community of practice as a forum that you can join and connect with other people working in the same country or in different countries to come together across different institutions and work on projects or even documents of common interest that you might take to policymakers. Or otherwise inform the discussion, such as what we're doing here in this webinar on, a discussion towards the Food System Summit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I might really quickly ask one more question before we move on. We had a question from Barbara Doyle. What is your view on the role of advances in agricultural biotechnology in helping to reduce costs and inputs such as pesticides, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's so context specific. I didn't talk much about the food safety piece, but it is definitely an issue, again, on how do we reduce costs and increase access to healthy diets sustainably. we clearly want to do that in a way that would not increase contamination, food safety risks. That's actually a really big issue in South Asia, of a reason why people don't consume more vegetables and fruits in particular, because of risks of food safety risks, justified or otherwise, of pesticide and chemical contamination. So it's certainly an important issue. I don't think there's an across the board answer for everywhere, but ways to produce healthy foods more sustainably, I think, is the main point, and that should always be front of mind.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. That was fascinating. And thank you, everybody, for your really insightful and interesting questions. We have a lot in the chat box, which will keep Dr. Herforth very busy for the next few minutes. So moving on to session 2, which is on evidence and responses from Irish and international development partners. So we have seen the global picture. We are going to take a closer look now at what Irish and international development partners are doing to address issues around cost of diet. We will hear evidence and responses from Zambia, Malawi, Niger, and Liberia. So I'd like to introduce Mary Corbett, who is going to present Self-Help Africa's Cost of Diet study from Northern Zambia. Mary is a nutrition advisor with Self-Help Africa. So welcome, Mary, the floor is yours.
Hi there, how are you doing? There's a presentation, yeah? Yeah, great, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Mary Corbett, as Sophia introduced me. Just to show you this picture here, this picture is from Northern Zambia, and there's 3 cobs of corn there, and they're different colors. The middle one is white, which is the normal cob that's used. It's normal maize that's eaten in Zambia. To the left is a yellow maize, and to the right is an orange maize. It's not easy to see it there, but it's biofortified maize. And it's very, very important, I guess, when we're looking at micronutrient deficiencies in particular, and how to make food maybe a bit more cost affordable, I guess. So if you go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to present today on, just to explain Self-Help Africa. Self-Help Africa is an international NGO. Our focus is on agriculture and enterprise. And I came on board about 6-7 years ago to put a strong nutrition component into our agriculture and enterprise programs. So this program I'm presenting on in particular is a large program that we ran up in Northern Province in Zambia between 2013 and 2018 in 2 districts. It was a 6-year program that was funded by Irish Aid. The area itself is really very isolated. It's on the border with Tanzania. It's around 1,000 kilometers from Lusaka, the capital. So, and the road infrastructure, particularly as you go more rural, is quite challenging. The project itself targeted 16,000 households, which was around 90,000 clients. The overall goal of this project was to improve the livelihoods, health status, food and nutrition security of poor households in Northern Province, with a particular focus on women and vulnerable groups. So the next slide. Just literally briefly, as you see, from the slide there, Tanzania is right up in the right-hand corner with of the map there, and just literally below that, where the 2 big towns are highlighted, is where the project area was, and Lusaka is right down in the corner there on the left-hand side. So the 3 main objectives were to increase market-orientated sustainable agricultural production and productivity. So that's looking at production and productivity, and then looking at nutritional status, improving household nutrition status and health for vulnerable households. And then thirdly, to strengthen the district authorities' capacity. Next slide. In the two districts were quite different, and at the very start of the project, we did an IHM, which is similar to a HEA, which is a household economy analysis, which is a way of looking at the population and looking at livelihoods, and to try and understand what are the main livelihoods that people get their resources from. So in Mbala, the two districts we worked in were Mbala and Luingo. In Mbala, there was just one livelihood zone, and that was maize, cassava, and bean zone. So that's basically what they grew, what they produced for consumption and for sale as well. In the Luingo, there were 3 livelihood zones, but the one that we focused on was the first one here, cassava, groundnut, and rice zone. There were 2 other ones with fish as part of it, pond fish and lake fish. But we only did the cost of diet in one in Luingo and one in Mbala. Next slide. So briefly context, there are 3 seasons in Northern Province. It's the rainy season is from November to April, and it's actually, they get really heavy rain. So it's actually quite good for producing crops in that period, but it is only one season. So literally one rainy season. So it's one main crop then. Then there's a cold season from April to August and a dry season from August to November. And why we're highlighting the seasons is that what is available and what's produced in the different seasons is really quite different. And the supply of food and the availability of food can be very different. And it's quite important to understand that when you're looking at the cost of diet, because it can be really quite significantly different in different seasons. In this particular area, nutrition status, in particular, chronic malnutrition is unbelievably high. It's around 50% for children under 5 years, which is staggeringly high. Acute malnutrition never seemed to go terribly high, but it's kind of probably only about 4 or 5% generally. And the IHM, which is individual household methodology, which is similar to the HEA, it showed at the beginning of the project that 57% of the population could access sufficient food for the year. So that meant that more than 40% didn't have sufficient food available for the year, and 42% were below the standard of living threshold. So high levels of poverty really, and high levels of food insecurity as well. Next slide, please. Why did we do cost of diet, and what information did we want to try and understand from this? Number one, just what foods are available in the markets, what foods are available, wild foods, so that, because they can be a really important part of a diet, particularly a minimal diet in terms of, for micronutrients in particular. What is the cost of a nutritionally adequate diet for a typical household in different livelihood zones? How affordable is a nutritious diet? What nutrients have the greatest influence on the cost of diet? What local foods are inexpensive sources of essential micronutrients? And how might nutrition, food security, and social protection interventions improve access to nutritious foods? Next slide, please. Then the methodology, how we went about it, we did market surveys, normally did them in the morning. You choose each food has that's available. You weigh the smallest quantity, because poor people only buy generally what they require for the day, for that particular day, because they don't have sufficient income to maybe buy for the week. So whatever, and normally when you buy small quantities, when you actually calculate it to the kilo, it actually ends up being a bit more expensive than if you actually bought bigger quantities. So this is a way of actually finding out how much it costs poor people to buy the equivalent of a kilo of any of the foods at the time. Collect data from 4 traders in each market just to get an idea and kind of get an average cost. And then, as well as looking at the markets, we did interviews with women in particular, and we did individual interviews and also group interviews, looking at what they normally eat and what they don't eat, what taboos they have around certain foods. And then we had secondary data from other sources as well. Next slide, please. So this one, the results. So then when we collected all this data, we put it into the cost of diet software, which was developed by Save the Children a number of years ago, and it has been kind of further developed over the years. So if you look at, when you're calculating a diet for a family, you calculate it depending on, we'll say a family of 6, a family of 7, whatever, and the different groups. So you'll have, because different children will have different needs. So you might have a child of between 3 and 5, a child under 24 months, and their calorie and their nutrition needs are different. So you need to calculate for different household members to get an accurate idea of what exactly are the needs. So if you look at this in the first, for Mbala, which is at the top, that we divide into the rainy season, cold season and dry season. And as you see, the difference in the rainy season, it's quite a lot more expensive. It's 300 kwacha during the rainy season, while it's only 135 during the dry season. During the cold season, we have a 0 because they produce food and they eat it during the cold season. So they really don't need to buy food during the cold season because it's literally after the rainy season when they harvest and the food is available. With the Luingo, which is the 3 lower columns below, or rows below, similar prices again, and similar prices with the rainy season and the dry season being much cheaper, cheaper to buy and supply foods. Part of that is because the rainy season is when they produce their food, and it harvests at the end of the rainy season into the cold season, and they may have some food to keep them going into the dry season and maybe even throughout the dry season, but not necessarily back into the rainy season. And just to give it context, the currency is almost 12 kwacha, Zambian kwacha to €1. And data from the IHM showed that for Mbala, their income, their annual income was 744 kwacha, which is very, very small, which is only €62.5. And for Luingo, it's even less. It was only 718, which is about €60. So as you can see here, they're spending, similar actually to what Anna presented earlier on, they're spending nearly 60% of their income on food. So, which is really interesting. Next slide, please. So, sorry, the last slide was literally a calorie-only diet. So it means that literally it gives them enough calories. But if you want to have a good nutritious diet, which you have macronutrients and micronutrients, when we used the data that we collected and we analyzed it, the cost of diet for a micronutrient diet was significantly higher. It actually went from around 450 to 5,900 for Mbala, and for Luingo 7,800. So this shows that a nutritious diet is absolutely unaffordable for poor people. Next slide, please. Then in the food habits diet, this is the food that people would really like to eat themselves. You might be able to, they may have a cheaper version available in the area, but it's not basically what they want to eat. So what they would like themselves to eat. For Mbala, it was slightly cheaper than the nutritious diet. And for Luingo, I think it was about the same, or very similar anyway. And next slide. I'm sorry, now we're flying through this because of time constraints. So the key findings from the study were There is sufficient variety between homegrown foods and what's available in the market for a nutritious diet for all members of the household, which is good news. This means that actually the food, there is availability. Its supply is probably the issue. Limited availability of vegetables in the cold season affects availability and affordability of nutritious diet. And in this particular area, there were market issues as well, as in the markets were very fragile, to be honest. Green leafy vegetables available in the rainy season, greatest source of vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin B1, 2, and 6, folic acid and calcium. So that just shows how important these green leafy vegetables are for the diet, and could be available more throughout the year. Contribution of wild foods was important, particularly at certain times of the year, and fruit was the main contribution that they had. They had some really interesting fruit in that area. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Mary, due to time constraints, just
one more slide.
Okay, thank you.
Most costly nutrient is vitamin B12, and that was really a major issue because you need either fish, meat, dairy, eggs are the main source for vitamin B12, and particularly in this particular area, dairy was not available. Animals were scarce, so to buy any of these products was quite expensive. Actually, the cost of diet showed that to have any of these foods within the diet was added about 50 to 60% onto the cost of a nutritious diet. So this is where the real big problem is for poor communities in rural settings like this. The food habit diet was more expensive than nutritious diet, and these were the choices and the preferences. Interestingly, millet, which is a really good staple food, was considered a poor person's food. There seemed to be a bit of stigma around it, which was really quite a shame because it's actually very nutritious. And cost of energy only diet was 56%. That again, poor infrastructure included. And next slide. From the beginning of the project to the end of the project, some of the benefits and some of the work that we did, some of the results were as follows. We had an improvement in access to food throughout the year from 57% to 67%, which was really important and really valuable. Reduction in the percentage of living below the standard of living threshold, down from 42% to 33%. An improvement in access to saving schemes, which is really vital for people as a coping strategy. Women's decision-making power had improved by 50%. And in terms of nutrition, then there was an improvement in dietary diversity, not massive, but definitely more consumption of vegetables, pulses, and fish. And there was an improvement in infant and young child feeding practices, with minimum acceptable diet improving, and there were some changes in reduction in stunting for children less than 18 months, which was really very encouraging. I think that's the last slide.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mary. It's unfortunate in this virtual world that we're so stuck to time constraints, but thank you for all that information. I'm going to quickly go on to Lily Schofield, and we're going to keep all the Q&A to the chat box. So please, Mary, have a look at the chat box. So Lily Schofield is going to present on how Save the Children is piloting cost of diet and household economy analysis to assess COVID impacts on diet affordability. She is a senior research and impact advisor at Save the Children. Welcome, Lily, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to be on this panel. If my slides could come up, brilliant. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, so today I'm going to be presenting on a pilot that's actually still ongoing, so it's quite preliminary and fresh data, where we're using cost of the diet and household economy analysis to see if we can adapt these methods to kind of look at relatively real-time impacts of COVID and associated control measures on diet affordability. Next slide. So the rationale behind this pilot, I think, as we all are well aware, as COVID-19 kind of rolled out across the globe, we saw kind of restrictions in movement, curfews, lots of market disruptions and disruptions of livelihoods themselves, as well as border closures that affected movement of people and foods, and kind of changes and increases in food prices in a lot of settings. And so we became curious, could we use kind of cost of diet and household economy analysis, which are two tools that we use very frequently at the beginning of programs to inform programmatic design, to better understand the kind of evolving impacts of COVID and associated restrictions on access and affordability of nutritious diet. Next slide, please. So I'm not gonna, because of time, I'm not really gonna go into the methods in too much detail, but I will put in the chat box a link to the HEA Cost of Diet website, and Mary also explained a fair bit about cost of diet. But basically, you know, cost of diet is looking, essentially trying to understand, can the poorest afford a nutritious diet? What kind of locally available foods can make up that diet? And what are the kind of affordability gaps? And household economy analysis really helps us to understand at a granular level how households make ends meet in terms of food, income, and expenditure. Next slide, please. So we found a little bit of funding, and we identified 2 pilot locations where we could kind of tack this work on to existing ongoing programs. So one was in Niger, in Zinder region in the agro-pastoralist livelihood zone. You can see that red circle there. And the other was in Malawi in Zomba district, which covered 2 different livelihood zones, the Sheer Highlands and the Lake Chilwa Plain. Next slide. So we needed to adapt the approach. Typically with the cost of the diet, you'd go and collect price information on all of the foods available in your target market. So that might be upwards of 200 different foods, collecting price and weight information. But we knew that that really wasn't going to be feasible, because one of the things we were trying to see is, can we get kind of frequent data to understand how prices and affordability are changing? So we ended up taking 2 different approaches in the 2 pilot sites. In Niger, we didn't really have secondary food price monitoring data that was on a diverse enough set of foods to be able to look at a nutritious diet. So there is price monitoring available on staples, but that's, you know, as we know, staples really isn't sufficient. So what we did is we took the nutritious diet food list from a previous cost of diet that was done in October of 2019, and we identified the 17 foods that went into that kind of food habit diet, and we decided we were going to monitor the price of those 17 foods on a monthly basis within 4 markets. We also collected retrospective information by interviewing traders from January of 2020 through October, and then we have prospective data from November onwards. And when we came to analysis, we adjusted the diets just for staple consumption patterns, partly because we were looking at a restricted food list. We didn't apply all of the kind of food habit constraints that we might in a normal cost of the diet. Now in Malawi, there actually is, through WFP at a national level, a minimum food expenditure basket that they monitor through a phone-based survey, and that includes just under 30 foods from multiple different food groups, and they collect this monthly across the whole country. So we decided that we would use this secondary data and extract the information from the markets within our area of interest, and see how that worked in terms of looking at the change in affordability over time. And again, we adjusted the diets just for the staple consumptions and also for cowpeas. For HEA, we collected data on the super key parameters, which are basically those aspects of livelihoods and incomes that are going to change in the short term and would kind of drive overall livelihoods for the households through focus group discussions on a monthly basis. starting in November of last year. I'm not going to present on the HEA data today, partly due to time and partly due to the fact that we're still analyzing that data. Next slide, please. So results from Niger. Next slide. So this shows the cost and composition of nutritious diet per month, starting from January 2020 through to February of this year. And what you can see is a couple of things. So first of all, we see that the price varied across the year, and largely it followed, in 2020, it followed kind of a normal seasonal pattern where the period of the highest prices was during the kind of lean season of the year. And the overall composition in terms of food groups and the cost per food group kind of stayed relatively consistent. What's interesting is that we've seen in the data that's come in January and February of this year that there's been a significant increase in prices, so that January, February prices in 2021 are looking quite similar to the peak lean season prices in June and July of last year. And this is also largely coincided with kind of the second wave of COVID that's affecting a lot of the region. So this is kind of, we're starting to see, I think, some of the COVID impacts, as well as some decreased production that's led to kind of increases in cereal prices in the region. Next slide. So we also then looked at affordability, focusing particularly on very poor households. So typically we look at, we divide communities into 4 wealth groups: very poor, poor, middle income, and better off. And what's interesting here is actually when we compared the affordability for very poor households of a nutritious diet from October of 2019 to October of 2020, the affordability gap actually improved. So it was still above the total income that those households had. So you can see in both cases, we're still over 100%, but it actually decreased a bit between 2019 and 2020. However, when we look at January and February of 2020 and 2021, those kind of price increases that we saw on the previous slide have translated into an increase in the affordability gap from about 107% in January 2020 to 127% in January of this year, and similarly in February. Next slide. So then when we go to Malawi, next slide. So in Malawi, we were looking at 2 different livelihood zones. So you can see the blue circles represent the Sheer Highlands zone, the monthly price for an average family, and the red X's, the Chilwa Lake Plain. You can see that in general, the prices were lower in Chilwa Lake for an average family. Both of the livelihood zones saw a kind of a slight increase towards the end of last year and into the beginning of this year, which again corresponds to the second wave of COVID kind of in Malawi, and we've seen kind of increasing restrictions. So for much of 2020, there weren't very severe restrictions. There was kind of messaging around social distancing and hygiene, but since the second wave has hit, there's been more kind of direct restrictions put in place. Next slide. We also looked at the cost for particular nutritionally vulnerable members of the household. So this, for example, looks at a reproductive age woman, a pregnant woman, and a lactating woman, and looks at the price per day across the year. And we could see that, the lactating woman had the highest cost, but that they kind of followed the same pattern. So this kind of information can be useful when we think about designing things like maternity cash transfers, for example. Understanding how costs will vary across the year will help us to ensure that, we design transfers that are adequate to kind of cover needs throughout the 1,000-day period. Next slide. This is affordability analysis. So in the Chilwa Lake zone, we saw actually throughout 2020, there is a very large affordability gap compared, when we look at incomes compared to the cost of nutritious diet. It exceeded almost 250% of income. And again, the affordability gap increased towards the end of 2020 and into early 2021. Next slide. So in summary, what we found our pilot does have some limitations. So because we're looking at a limited list of foods and a limited number of markets, we know we may not have been looking at the absolute cheapest diets available in these locations, because there may be certain foods that we didn't include in our food list that might have been a slightly cheaper source of nutrients than the ones that we looked at. But in terms of understanding general trends, I think it's still useful. Again, in Niger, we collected retrospective data, which there's always a risk of recall bias in that. And because the pilot locations were largely where we could get this up and running relatively quickly on existing programming footprints, they weren't necessarily those areas that were the worst hit by COVID and COVID restrictions. So for example, we know that urban poor faced quite severe shocks on both their livelihoods and food prices, but these programs happen to be in more rural areas. Even given those limitations, though, I think we found that regular affordability analysis was feasible on a shortened food list and did give us useful information in terms of trends. Looking at a livelihood zone level, that analysis highlighted some local variations in affordability. For example, in our Malawi data, we saw that within the livelihood zones we were looking at, we saw kind of increasing affordability gaps at the beginning of this year, even though maize prices nationally are falling in Malawi. So be interesting to see if that persists. And having this kind of trend analysis could be very useful as we think about some of the response mechanisms, particularly shock responsive social protection, for example. Understanding how affordability varies in a normal year and in a shock year may help to kind of design those programs more robustly. And lastly, from the data that we've seen, though it's still evolving, we're seeing some of the impacts of the second wave of COVID, kind of worsening affordability, and that raises questions about what are going to be the knock-on effects of that on malnutrition kind of in the months to come. So I'd also just like to thank our teams in Niger and Malawi for being incredibly flexible and adaptable throughout the last year as we got this pilot up and running and pulling in some really useful data with really minimal resources. So that is it for me.
Great, thank you so much, Lily. That was fascinating, and it's really interesting to see how the global context fits in to the localized contexts. In the interest of time, please send your questions into the Q&A box or the chat box, and I encourage Lily and Mary to look at those and answer any. So without further ado, we will go on to Joseph Odiak, who is going to present evidence from a cost of diet assessment conducted in Liberia by Concern Liberia. Joseph is a nutrition program manager with Concern Liberia, and I would also just like to remind that we are 10 minutes behind. So Joseph, if you could stay on time to the 10 minutes, we would be immensely grateful. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you. Could you share the video, the presentation? All right. Thank you. I will share a brief presentation on cost of diet in Liberia. I'm Joseph, nutrition coordinator currently in Liberia. Next slide, please. Yeah, briefly we shall talk about the Liberia country and the situation, nutrition situation, brief on the cost of diet assessment, approaches we are currently using, what challenges and opportunities we have to address access and affordability of nutritious foods. Next slide, please. Yeah, so Liberia is a country estimated around over 4.5 million people with an average range of around 4,150. It has experienced a civil war for over 14 years between 1989 and 2003. Right now, it's peaceful, politically stable. And recently, in 2014, 2015, we had an Ebola outbreak, and now COVID-19 impact that is impacting the economy and also associated. Yeah, so next slide, please. So in terms of nutrition, currently the country has a stunting rate of around 30%. Not so worrying with wasting, although it's in some few locations, The prevalence of anemia is around 7 to 1 point, which is very critical according to WHO standards. And for anemia among women of reproductive age 15 to 49, it's 45%. Next slide, please. In brief, as previous presenters have said, we use the Save the Children cost of diet assessment, which is a methodology and a software that tries to estimate combinations and amount of locally available foods needed to provide either individuals or households with a diet that meets the energy, protein, fat, and micronutrient needs. It also tries to come up with nutrients that are hard to obtain in the local foods, and also what could be the least expensive sources of energy and other nutrients in the different foods. Continue. Next slide, please. So the information obtained is used to promote foods that are low cost, highly nutritious, safe, and culturally appropriate. That is very, very important, culturally appropriate diets, and an adequate quantity and quality to meet the recommended dietary intake for specific age groups or target groups that you're looking in within a particular population. Next slide, please. The key questions, cost of diet answers is what is the minimum cost of food that meets nutrient needs for a typical household? So, for example, in Liberian context, we look at typical household as having at least 5 people. And can a nutritious diet be achieved using locally available foods? Is this diet affordable? If not, what could be done? Next slide, please. So the cost of diet assessment was conducted in 3 livelihood zones. One of the zones was the one that typically grows rice, cassava, as step 1, also looking at the market gardening. The second livelihood zone we looked at was the one that had rice, cassava, and doing inland fishing. And then the third was the one where we had rubber, charcoal with the different food groups. This was trying to get a representative of the different livelihood zones in the country. Although currently the country is divided into the 5 livelihood zones, but we selected 3 to be representative of all the livelihood zones. Next slide, please. So what were the key findings? One is when we're looking at the cost, in the central, or what we call the rice, cassava, and market gardening, I would only look at the annual diet cost because of the price. In the rice, cassava marketing zone, the price was around 760 USD, while United States dollars, while in the coastal plain, cassava, rice, and inland fishing, the annual cost of a very good diet is at 684. And then lastly, in the rubber, charcoal with food crops is around 697. So in brief, from the previous presentation, I didn't want to go into what the different categories of the assessment looked at in terms of the energy, the food habits, but this looks at the food habits assessment and what a typical household is supposed to consume. So overall, most poor households and the very poor households spend more than 100% of their annual income to achieve the nutritious diet. All households can afford an energy-only diet, but this does not meet the requirements for protein, fat, and the 13 micronutrients that were assessed, typically vitamin B12, niacin, iron, and zinc. Next slide, please. So the nutrients that were contributing to the high cost of foods were vitamin B12, which can be got in bony fish, canned sardines, catfish, cow meat, dry. Fat, which can be got from vegetable oil, coconut, bony fish. Niacin, which can also be got from bony fish, bread nut, cassava, cassava leaves, and all these other food groups. Iron, which can be got from bony fish, bread nut, cassava, and then zinc. So looking at all these nutrients that were lacking in these foods, you'll find most nutrients were found in the bony fish. Although the bony fish may be recommended, but the price, according to poor households, may not afford it. Then also we had snails. If you look at it, snails, one of the that usually consumed by the people here, it's one of the foods that are rich in vitamin B12 and zinc. So in the next slides, you will see what were the key recommendations and how, so the other challenges that are affecting the availability you can go to the next slide. The other challenges that are affecting affordability is when we looked at the study was the increase in prices during the rain season. So you'll find during the dry season, the prices during the dry season and the rainy season, in the rainy season, the prices doubled. So you'd find maybe the cost of maybe fish could be like at $4, and then in the rainy season, it goes up to $8. This is because of access and challenges they have in transportation. We have inflation and also currency depression that affects the prices of foods and which affects overall affordability of foods. There are production challenges such as beans, which is very nutritious, but the cost is high because it's no longer grown so much into the country because of the soils, and also importation of the seeds is also very costly. Country is also highly dependent on imports. For example, rice is the main staple food and it's mostly imported, although we have areas that grow the import, that grow the rice, and then pests and diseases that usually affect the crops. Next slide, please. So what opportunities are we trying to have within the country, and also how the cost of diet has helped us design our interventions to address the food security and nutrition situation? One is trying to make sure sessions are conducted within the community such that we promote what is available within the community. We're also trying to promote homegrown staples such as pineapples, cassava, vegetables. The country is so dependent on imports, and that is something that we're trying to address on. How do we boost staples in the country such that households are able to produce staples and also be able to consume the staples other than importing, which usually makes the food not so affordable to the. They're also engaging the private sector. This is more on value addition, on how you can make foods rich. For example, how do you make, for example, the cassava that we grow? How do you process it? How do you add value such that you are able to meet all the recommended nutrients? And also promoting nutrition sensitive and also other snail rearing. For example, right now we have projects that are targeting snail rearing, because which is very rich in vitamin B12, very cost effective, and also very nutritious for a household. And also in terms of access, households are able to access both the poor and the very poor within a community. Next slide. So the other thing that we have tried to address, especially when we had the cost of that assessment done, we worked together with the Ministry of Health to come up with what we call a recipe booklet. So the cost of that identified the foods that could be promoted that are less costly and could be affordable to the community, although they lack certain nutrients. So to overcome especially the micronutrients, we are trying to increase the awareness and also coverage of the micronutrient powder to cover gaps of iron, zinc, such that when a household is consuming particular recipes we are promoting, we are trying also to make sure the issues of micronutrients is also addressed. We're also trying to promote snail rearing to also overcome the issue of vitamin B12 deficiency and zinc within the communities we work in. Next slide, please. So I would like to thank Irish Aid, which provided funding for the cost of data assessment, and also assessment that was led by Catherine, research teams, and communities. So thank you very much. I know because of time, I tried to be very fast, but I would be present throughout the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for staying on time. You've really helped us in that regard. And I know some questions have come in for you on the chat and through the Q&A box. So it would be great if you could keep an eye on that. Thank you so much again. So now we're moving into session 3 on game-changing solutions for access to nutrition. We're very lucky to have Karina Hawkes in the room. So we heard in the last session that the role of Irish and international development organizations in supporting access to nutrition. This issue is also a focus for action for the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit, and efforts are underway to identify game-changing solutions to access nutrition. So we are delighted to welcome our next speaker, Karina Hawkes, who is going to present on actions to address food affordability and how adaptation to context and population is key. Karina is the Director of the Centre for Food Policy at City University London. She is currently serving as the Access to Nutritious Food Lead as part of the Food Systems Summit Action Track 1. She blogs at thebetterfoodjourney.com. So welcome, Karina. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Great to be here. And thanks very much for the invitation to speak. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Great. Well, thank you. And what I'm about to say really does build very much off what I've been listening with interest about what previous panelists have been saying, and it very much builds from that. So on my first slide, the next slide, please. I just highlight the UN Food Systems Summit process. So as Sophie said, I'm lead of the working group on nutritious foods, which is one of 3 working groups in Action Track 1, and on ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all. And the purpose of the action track is to identify actions to end hunger, all forms of malnutrition, and the incidence of obesity and NCDs. That's the basic goal, and the focus is on access and affordability. Though, as you'll see, it inevitably has to be a little bit broader than that. So on the next slide, I put what these actions are being called, which is game-changing actions, which is an interesting terminology that has introduced some discussion and debate and energy into the discussion. And I think it seems very different people see what game changing means in different ways. And that's certainly been a challenge, I would say, for this process. And in my working group, in our discussions, we agreed that if something was going to be game changing, when it comes to access and affordability of nutritious foods, it had to be game changing in the context of people's real lives. And if it didn't have impact on the ground, however nice it looked on paper, it wasn't going to be game changing. And also that it should be something that changes the rules of the game, that really has a transformative kind of potential. That was our initial discussion. And the formal definition, the things that these actions are rated against, is are they actionable, scalable, and sustainable? And the way that I've understood this and have positioned these actions is that collectively they should lead to a fundamental shift in the way food systems operate, and that they should bring co-benefits, not just for nutrition, but for other food systems goals, such as climate change reduction, environmental benefits, livelihoods, resilience, and so on, which are covered in the other action tracks. So on the next slide, I'm going to start setting out the approach that we took in the working group, which was to say, well, if we're going to provide solutions, game-changing solutions to problems around affordability, and the focus will be on affordability, then we have to understand what the problems are. And Anna Herforth, in her presentation, made this very, very clear, that prices are just one element, and that there's another kind of layer at the top around convenience and other elements, which I'll very much be looking at in my presentation. Because the assumption, and this is directly from the State of Food Insecurity report, which Anna's work was published in, it's absolutely superb report and an excellent, incredibly important piece of work, I have to say, that the headline news out of this was that a healthy meal costs 5 times more than a starch-only meal. And that's great analysis. No, that's not inaccurate, it's accurate, as Anna has presented. However, the message that can send to people is that the problem is that healthier foods are more expensive, and that's it. That is the problem. Whereas actually, when you look at the evidence, as we've heard, I think in pretty much all the presentations today, that it's a little bit more complex than that. So I'm going to set out the 5 different problems around affordability that we understand, based on taking a people-centered approach to understanding how people react and what influences the foods that they decide to access and eat. So I'm going to set out 5 different problems around affordability, and then give the solutions which we introduce as part of our selection of solutions in the action track. So going on to the first one then. The first problem is one that's been highlighted already, is one of poverty, essentially. So it can't just be about price, because obviously there are some people who can afford those foods. It's because some people are on low incomes. And we know that low-income households, from the evidence, are very skilled, very intelligent, and very skilled in how they manage their food budgets. But because income is low, and it's also variable and unpredictable, which is also incredibly important, that influences buying practices. And of course, one of the ways that influences buying practices is that they're going to buy less expensive foods. So cost, there's an interaction with costs, such as staples, as we've heard, and just those energy products like staples. And then to buy cheaper forms of the same foods, such as cheaper meats, and try and find price deals wherever they can. But also, they're going to make choices that are shaped by things like cost per calorie, like, why would I, even if a cabbage is cheap, why would I buy it when I'm not getting my calories for money, as it were? And the need to fill children up on starches and fats is very, very common. But also things like saying, well, if I was wealthier, I could afford to waste a bit of food if someone in my family didn't like it. I can't afford to waste any food. So it interacts with price as well as some of these other elements, as was indicated earlier. So the solution that we proposed in the action track to that on the next slide is that the solution to the problem is listed at the top there, were several of them. And one of them was around women-led enterprise for neglected crops, and indigenous crops and underutilized species have been mentioned earlier as well. But the idea for this is that, especially in areas where social protection systems are pretty weak, that, and my colleague Maureen, I should thank everybody, by the way, for, these are not my ideas, these are the ideas of the group that my colleague Maureen from Kenya put forward, is that there needs to be a way that women who are making choices for themselves and for their families can actually become financially empowered. So that's about using the food system as a source of increasing the financial resources and finances available to women to make those choices. And by engaging directly and making those activities about the food system, which neglected crops are often more sustainable and so on, then you've got a win-win of producing healthier foods that the women can then eat as well as sell for money. Another solution, of course, has been mentioned, which is about social safety net, social protection, about making those cash transfers larger to account for the cost of more nutritious foods and healthier diets, has always been set out very clearly, but also introducing elements into them that creates incentives and allocates vouchers, for example, for more nutritious foods. But the other element about low-income households not having enough money is that if then food is freely available in other settings, such as in school food programs, that is another form, of course, of social safety net, because it means that if the family doesn't have enough money, at least the kids are eating at school. So these are 3 of the solutions that we proposed. The second problem on the next slide is that nutritious foods and healthy diets are more expensive. That has already been set out extremely clearly. However, the issue really comes into play when those nutritious foods and healthier foods are the foods that people actually want to eat. And again, that has been mentioned in the second presentation today, that when you cost things out by foods that actually there is demand, there is aspiration, they are appealing, they are convenient, they're foods that people actually want to eat. That's where the real issue comes into play when it comes to the cost of food. So that means that it's about making those foods which lower income populations do want to eat, the nutritious, healthier foods, making them more affordable. And that's going to vary with context. Where I live in the UK, milk, the cost of milk is not really that significant for many people. However, there are many parts of the world where porridge will be served with water rather than milk because of the cost with milk, again, undermining the ability to feed children well. In a country like the UK, it's more likely to be berries, which are very expensive, but highly desirable for families and for children. And of course, this is compounded by other factors where, such as, and this is just one of many examples, where perhaps women would choose to spend more money on those more costly foods and take the money from another part of their budgets, for those who are not in absolute abject poverty, that is. But they may have not the decision-making powers to go to do that. So again, there's other interacting factors. So the solutions that we proposed for this, again, have already been mentioned today on the next slide. And the first one was sorry, is this the next slide? Thank you very much. So the first solution was about investment in infrastructure for nutritious food. So this can be anything from market infrastructure has been mentioned, cold chains already been mentioned, things that address the fact that these crops, these foods may be unavailable out of season, which makes them more expensive. All of those very supply side factors, which can and make a real difference to try and lowering the price of those foods and those specific foods. The challenge is that targeting the foods that are there is actually a demand for. But there's also other ways of saying, well, if food is going to be high priced in the market, then are the ways of providing food. It's like the same as school food. It's the same thing of providing food to people in a way which means they don't actually have to pay for that. And food at work, we have one which is on workplace food schemes, where perhaps employers who've got a little bit more money to spend can actually serve those foods in foods that they provide for people at work. So problem number 3 on the next slide. This has already been mentioned. Nutritious foods may actually be completely affordable, totally affordable. There may not be the ones which are most desirable, but there may be ones which are affordable and available at low prices. And as was mentioned earlier, however, they may be low status. You hear things like poor people's food, food for the animals. And so there's the status element, but there's also the convenience element, especially when in the context of time, energy, and skill that normally women need to put into preparing food. So you've got these products like millets and so on that can be seen as they're very affordable, but they may not be seen as very convenient. And so that means that foods that those of us who spend a lot of time preparing food and value spending a lot of time preparing food and aren't worried about status issues, such as those green leafy vegetables on the left, we're fine, but not for those in a very different life circumstance. So the solution that we propose to that in the action track on the next slide is that we crowd in small and medium-sized enterprises who are going to be entrepreneurial and innovative and perhaps making products from those nutritious foods into more convenient forms, such as bean flours, for example. But to do that, we need to make sure that those small and medium-sized enterprises are supported. So our solution was about an innovation platform for SMEs of manufacturers of convenient and nutritious foods that are going to fit into the lives of very busy people much more easily. I've only got a minute or a few minutes left, so I'll just take a couple of more minutes. And then the next problem 4, is that healthy foods may in fact be affordable, as I've just said, and they may even be desirable, but they will be perceived that they are too expensive. So people don't even think about going to buy them. They're just like, no, that's not for me. And this picture on the left is from someone in the, again, in a high income country context, who talks in her cookery books about how in fact you can make meals like this for 36 pence and they don't need to be expensive. And so the solution for this on the next slide was awareness campaigns and use of influences with commercial know-how, and that are appealing to people to try and change that perception, which we included in another action that we proposed. And then the final problem about affordability on the next slide is frankly that ultra-processed junk foods, as well as fried street foods, oils and sugar, are widely accessible and are perceived as affordable and appealing. So even when they are not, even when they may actually be more expensive than the low desirable nutritious foods, or even more expensive than the highly desirable nutritious foods, they bring value into people's lives. They're easy to like foods. Teenagers like to share them on the way back from school. It's a way of pacifying your child if there's don't have very much time to spend with them, because they're very easy to like. And those convenience and aspirational and appealing characteristics of these foods mean that they can crowd out nutritious foods. So in other words, the nutritious foods affordability agenda is not just about nutritious foods, but it's about clearing out the ultra processed stuff in order that we can have nutritious foods flood in and create appeal as well as affordability for those foods. And then the solutions for that on the next slide, which are around healthy food environment policies, the importance of defining what we mean by unhealthy foods, and disincentives for unhealthy food marketing. So that's what we did. That's what we put together based on those different problems. And those were the solutions that we put forward. So on the next slide, I revisit the slide I showed earlier. Are these game changing? I don't know. I'm not really sure exactly at this stage what we can define as game changing. What I am clear is that they're things that, if they were implemented well, would make a difference in the reality of people's lives. And what I'm also clear about is that collectively, they can lead to change, and they could lead to a fundamental shift. And they could also lead to co-benefits for other food systems outcomes. So on the next slide, I show how they fit together. You've got these different problems, which I've already just articulated. Now, if you put all of these together, what you end up doing is giving people more, financially empowering people. You're providing a space where they're more able to access healthier diets, and you are removing the space filled by the unhealthy foods, as well as reducing prices. So when you start to put that together, you can begin to think, we might get some systems transformation here, because you're acting on income, on prices, and on appeal, and on aspiration, and on the foods which compete with nutritious foods. And if you think about some of these actions, like if you invest in infrastructure, that can lead to higher producer prices. If you invest in SMEs, that can lead to business innovation. If you also invest in infrastructure, that can reduce waste. If you invest in women-led enterprises, then you're also tackling gender issues. If you're dealing with neglected, underutilized species, you're bringing some benefits for the environment. If you're doing a school food program and then making that school food program link with smallholder producers or nature-friendly producers, you're benefiting livelihoods and the environment. So you begin to see how these co-benefits can be created. And for a systems change approach, that you are changing the underlying rules of the game, actually by re-leveling the playing field to enable a nutritious foods economy by making all of those changes in synergy. So I think my experience of this process has been there's lots of actions that need to happen to tackle the different elements of this problem, but it's really only collectively that we will see, if all of these things are done, that we will see them make a difference. That said, you need to start somewhere. There's a lot on which to build, and so nothing wrong with doing one of them and then building from there. So just on the final slide, I just show that I've written up this story in the blog that I have here, if you want to see how I've set out those problems on the page. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Corinna. That was fascinating and really exciting. And I loved what you said, that those game-changing solutions really do need to change the game. They cannot just look pretty on paper. They have to work in real life. And I think you showcased some really good examples of how that can be done and how it is being done. So we have some great questions for you in the chat box. And I will also invite Nick to the floor to field some of the more scientific questions. But this one is from Stasia Norden. Is it that nutritious foods are more expensive, or that starchy foods are made artificially cheap from subsidies? Shouldn't we help ministries see that their policy of subsidizing starch is causing a problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. One of the reasons why both staple foods, starchy staples, and ultra processed foods are so cheap is because of the amount of investment that has gone into producing those foods, both from research and development, which started in the 40s, really, 1940s and onwards, and as well as policy support, which incentivizes farmers to produce very high amounts of those foods. And then the infrastructure was developed to make them into highly tradable goods. And they also, of course, act as animal feed. So soya, for example, is an oil, it's a food as well as an animal feed. And so the whole structure of the food system, the way that it was designed in the post-war period, was designed to make staples cheaper. That's what it was about. And it's done that extraordinarily well, extremely successful as a food system. And that's what needs to change now. It made sense at the time, but I think now we realize that just producing staples isn't the way to go.
Okay, really interesting. Nick, can I hand over to you for any more questions?
Oh, sure, there's a question from John Reed. John says, are we looking at the links between healthy living soil and producing healthy, nutrient-dense foods free of toxic pesticides to give healthy people, and how the action track process will link these issues up? And he says one obvious game changer would be the regenerative agriculture approach. And I suppose, I mean, there are, I think, 5 action tracks, Corinna, aren't there? So I guess that's partly looking at linkages across the action tracks. But anyway, what's your...
Yeah, that's correct. So there is one action track on nature-friendly food production, action track 3, and that's exactly what that is looking at. And we're undergoing quite an interesting process at the moment in the action track world of the UN Food Systems Summit of seeing how to connect those different elements. And as Anna Herford said, there is an understanding that just making food cheaper is not the answer because of all the other negative impacts it would have. And I think that's the advantage of the UN Food Systems Summit process, is that we're looking at these multiple outcomes at once. So things that might appear obvious for one silo of problems, actually you have to start saying, well, it's not just about making things cheaper so people can afford them, because if you're going to use certain agricultural methods, that might not have a cost raising impact rather than the other way around. And it's not just about that, it's about actually trying to make those market connections. So talking about direct linkages between producers and consumers, which can help reduce some of those costs in certain circumstances. So yes, that's a very important part of the UN Food Systems Summit Action Track process, and we're trying to work out how we can link up at the moment.
I I have noticed that there's another question on one of the specific game-changing solutions from Michael O'Brien, or O'Brien, apologies, Michael. Could you clarify the proposal on women-led enterprises for neglected crops? Does this include a focus on incentivizing farmer-led innovation in order to reduce dependence on proprietary technologies?
That isn't the particular focus of this one, and I actually think that Maureen might be on this session at the moment. I'm not sure, but it looks like she might be. This was more around targeting women who don't have any social security of any type, who currently have no livelihoods, and finding a way to establish women-led enterprises at quite a small scale. And that was really the focus. So gender was a really important part of this. So you can see it online, actually. I should put into the chat the details of all of these game changers are online and readily accessible.
I think, by the way, I'm not sure if Maureen, whether Maureen is on this webinar or not, I'm not quite sure, but Maureen will be talking, I think, at our next webinar, which is on women's empowerment and nutrition. So you can hear more about that game changer then as well. There's also a question from Una. Hi, Una Murray, about or asking for views on nutrition-related conditionality in cash transfer policy and design. So Una is saying in the social protection community, there's a move towards unconditional cash transfers, and maybe the issue relates to better targeting of social protection programs. So it'll be interesting to hear views on the experiences of social protection linkages and making nutritious food available.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting conversation, quite a live debate. And in the work that we were doing on nutritious social protection, we had people in the small group coming from quite different perspectives. So some of the people in the group were unconditional. Cash works, give people the money. We know from the evidence that a certain amount of that money will be spent on nutritious foods, and there's evidence that says that. And evidence that says that some of it will be, not all of it, of course, but some of it will be spent on food. And then you've got another camp who come from a rather different direction, who are saying make it conditional, because then you have make sure that that some of it is spent on nutritious foods. And it gets to a very, as I'm sure you're familiar, into a very fierce and sometimes unpleasant conversation. It didn't in our instance, but it can do. And so I think where we landed was that there needs to be an emphasis primarily on cash, and that it is simply not enough at the moment, as Anna said and others have said. Social protection is not enough to afford even a nutritious diet, let alone a healthy diet. So there needs to be a focus on increasing the amount of transfer in a cash transfer. But in addition to that, some incentivizing is the wrong word, some kind of support mechanism to enable people to identify, I'm going to spend this bit of money on nutritious foods, can be very beneficial, because in many parts of the world, if not most, people are surrounded by cheap, unhealthy junk foods. And I don't consider it people's fault that they're going out and buying cheap and unhealthy junk foods. I think it's because the food environment makes it extremely easy for them to do so. And so it's not about blaming people and saying we can't trust people. It's about saying we need to help people manage that wretched, unhealthy food environment. And one way to do that is to make sure that a certain amount of the money that they're getting, the transfer they're getting, will be spent on nutritious foods. And there's plenty of evidence to show that, well, there's some evidence, I should say, to show that that is welcomed by participants, as long as it doesn't replace the cash, and as long as that the emphasis is on unconditional provision of cash, but with some conditionalities put in there as well.
Mm. And sorry, I just to follow up on that quickly. I mean, you said about disincentives to the production of these junk foods. How far should that go, or how far can that go, or what are the kind of instruments that might be used?
Well, I mean, the instruments aren't we haven't actually included some of the strongest instruments yet. They may come in the next round. But the most obvious ones are these healthy food environment policies that restrict marketing of unhealthy foods, labels it, taxes it, and make sure that any retail setting doesn't overly promote it. And one of the big discussions that we had was about marketing of these foods. It's not the only solution at all, but it is potentially very important, because if you don't allow large food companies to market their foods, they just won't produce them. It's part and parcel of their product, the ability to market it. But it's extraordinarily difficult to do, because companies absolutely do not want it to happen. And they will find a way of wriggling out of it, whatever you do. So what we were exploring is, how can you do this differently? So we came on the idea of getting the investor community to put pressure on companies for corporate governance to change, so that corporate governance means that companies have to put purpose before profit, or not a purpose in line with profit. So the B corporations, I don't know whether you've come across that term, but it's about a change of corporate governance. So they can't say, they have to say, we're going to improve health, not exclude it. And the other way is to actually have the Googles of this world, and those in digital marketing, as well as billboards and others, say, we're not going to advertise this stuff. We're just not going to do it. They've got the power to do that. So I think we need to get creative about how we're going to stop this flood of food, because it's very, very difficult.
Okay, back to Sophie.
Great, thank you so much. It was really fascinating, and the chat and Q&A box has gone a bit crazy. So there are lots of people really, really interested in what's being said today, and I highly encourage everybody to attend the next few sessions that the Centre for Global Development and IFIAD are hosting on some of these topics. So in conclusion, so we heard from the global context what needs to change. The cost of nutritious diets on the market are more than people can afford. And this is exacerbated by COVID-19. And then we had a look at the real life solutions and knowledge and research and concerns from countries as we move closer towards the UN Food System Summit. Can a local diet be nutritious and affordable for local people? And if not, how can this be changed? We heard from Liberia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Niger. And then we heard about the UN Food System Summit's game-changing solutions. Nutritious foods may be available at low prices, but offer low perceived values. So how can this be changed? And how can this be changed fast? Game-changing solutions need to actually change the game. And there is a need to change the food environment, but also to help people manage this food environment. And I'd also like to add on that the UN Food System Summit is going into its second wave of game-changing solutions, and attendees here today can actually contribute further to these game-changing solutions if you go onto the UN Food System Summit website and have a little look under the action tracks, where you will find a survey and you can input your own game-changing solutions or any comments on the UN Food System Summit community platform, which it's a great place to chat to others and also talk more about some of the topics that have been discussed today, and hear from Maureen at a later session, a later one of these sessions, but also under action track 1 and all the other action tracks. So on that note, thank you everybody for attending today, and thank you to our amazing group of speakers and panelists. Your knowledge has been so valuable and really insightful, and I've really appreciated the time you have taken here today to talk to us, and I appreciate all the attendees who have stayed on and given their insights as well. So thank you so much. I'll see you at the next